Hi, my name's Gleeson. I'm the Director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, which is located here in the Melbourne School of Design. I'm here with Neil Brenner, who's Professor of Urban Theory and Director of the Urban Theory Lab at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. So welcome to Melbourne, Neil.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and it's just wonderful to have you here. You're here on a brief but busy visit this week, and it's pivoting around two main events. The first is a public lecture tonight on the urban age in question, and as its theme. And secondly, here to showcase a new exhibition which you and your team have been working on called Operational Landscapes Towards an Alternative Cartography of World Urbanization. I got that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, this is really a wonderful moment for us. We set up the Urban Theory Lab a couple years ago when I joined the Graduate School of Design. It's kind of an experiment with trying to develop new theoretical approaches to urban questions and trying to develop new ways of mapping urbanization processes. So it's been a project that has been closely linked to my teaching at the Graduate School of Design, as well as to some of my ongoing research with Christian Schmidt of the ETH in Zurich. So we've been sort of experimenting with some of our ideas, which I guess we'll be talking about today. And this is the first time that we've had the opportunity to publicly present some of our work in progress on trying to develop alternative ways of mapping world urbanization. So it's really a great moment for us. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the curatorial team for the exhibition, which is composed of Danielle Ibanez, Mariano Gomez-Luke, Chris Bennett, and Gurga Basic. We all work together very intensely to pull together a lot of material which has been produced by many other members of our research team at the Graduate School of Design.
Yeah, well, all credit to you and to your team, and it's nice to attribute them here in this way. And we're very honoured and we feel quite privileged to have this exhibition here. We also feel quite pressured, we have to say, because now we urbanists here are going to have to come up with exhibitions, a form of scholarly expression and exploration that urban social scientists haven't really ventured upon before. So there's a high level of innovation about what you're doing, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, let me say something about that. I mean, one of the, we think, somewhat unique aspects of our lab is precisely this point that you've underscored about connecting issues and frontiers in urban theory with visualization strategies. And it's a very interesting experiment, which is really very much open-ended right now. How can we develop visualizations, maps, cartographies of major approaches to urban theory? And in turn, how can we use the techniques of visualization as a way to develop new approaches to theorizing urbanization processes? So precisely that dialectic between theory, visualization, and then using visualization as a tool for developing new horizons for theoretical vision or theoretical ideas, that's a big part of what our whole agenda is about. And the exhibition is just really a first cut into trying to explore that interface between the theory, the sort of urban theory and mapping.
Yeah, no, and we, as I said, we're really excited to have this happening here in the house, in our new building here. So yeah, we're delighted about that. Just thinking about tonight's lecture, the urban age is something we've both pondered, considered. What do we mean by that? It's kind of meme that goes around now. The idea famously pronounced in about 2006 by the UN that we'd entered an urban age as a species, as a globe, because simply using a fairly simple number, this idea that preponderance, more than 50% of the human species were now living in urban settlements. So that's really taken hold, and it's sort of honked and almost celebrated actually now in some popular urban literature, which is welcoming us to an urban age and those kind of things. And also being taken up by the global institutionals, the UN obviously, but also World Bank and others saying, well, this is a really big new theme for us now. Okay, but the urban age and its discontents. Exactly. I think you're going to raise a few questions and perhaps doubts about the way that marker, that theme's been used and deployed in tonight's lecture. And I think one of the first sets of issues you would have with that, you'd bring to that, is just the empirical, the accuracy of that notion in respect to sort of the reality of urbanisation.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, there are a lot of issues on the table related to contemporary global urban discourse. And maybe first of all, just by way of background, I mean, this is something that I think we would both emphasize in our shared thinking about urban questions. Today, in global public discourse, urban questions have become absolutely central. Increasingly, debates about major global issues, society, economy, environment, inequality, debates on these issues connect to questions about cities and urbanization. So increasingly, urban questions are framed as part of debates about the future of humanity and the future of the planet. So urban questions for scholars like ourselves have always been important. We're very interested in cities and urbanization, but increasingly these questions have kind of a global dimension in global public discourse. So in this context, the question of how we think about cities and how we think about urbanization is absolutely fundamental, not only as an empirical problem, how do we measure city development, city growth, urbanization, but as a theoretical and interpretive problem. In other words, what is the interpretive framework? What is the theoretical framework that we're using to understand those settlements that we call cities and to understand those processes that we label urbanization? So, of course, the frameworks that we use today to think about those questions of city growth and urbanization are inherited from at least a century of urban social science and urban theory, which have been devoted to thinking about city development, city growth, urbanization. But one of the starting points for a lot of the work that I'm doing with my collaborators is the idea that inherited frameworks for thinking about cities and urbanization are actually increasingly inadequate. They're connected to earlier stages of capitalist development, earlier stages of urbanization, earlier forms of spatial inequality, and in the face of some of the global trends that we see today, increasingly they're inadequate, and therefore we need to reflect on how we might develop new categories, new frameworks, new interpretations for understanding and mapping urbanization processes. And so a lot of the work that we're doing in the Urban Theory Lab is precisely devoted to that question. Can we experimentally develop new interpretive frameworks, new cartographic frameworks that might provide a more adequate lens into thinking about the nature of urbanization processes around the world across different places and territories and at different scales as well. And so it's in that context that I'm very interested in this urban age debate. The notion of the urban age, the notion that we've entered an urban age because more than 50% of the world's population allegedly now lives within cities, whatever we mean by cities has to be unpacked, that's become kind of a placeholder in global public discourse on urbanization for understanding our urban question, our urban condition. That's become a kind of placeholder in global public discourse for understanding the contemporary urban condition. So the question I think that we need to debate about and reflect on is to what degree does that 50% urban threshold really capture the contemporary urban condition? Does it capture anything? Does it obfuscate? Does it confuse that urban condition? And the argument that I would make with Christian Schmidt, my collaborator, and with my colleagues in the Urban Theory Lab is that actually it does obfuscate. It illuminates something important about global demographic trends, but it also seriously confuses and hides very significant dimensions of worldwide urbanization processes that we urgently need to understand.
Can I just take a slightly different track off that? And I'm just mindful of Andrew Sayers' relatively recent book around urging a renewal in critical social science and reminding us that one of the first duties of critical social science is to explicate, bring things out, bring things to the fore which are not seen or hidden. The second is denaturalisation, to stop, well, at least to disrupt or interrogate that idea that things are just natural in the human world. That's the way they are, and they're like the natural world, and they behave in predictable ways and patterns, well, that can be understood in that way. Could I provoke you a little bit and say, if I explicate and almost denaturalise and bring out from behind your narrative is a strong critical neo-Marxian standpoint which brings to the fore and back into language and debate, which we don't see in official debate, the construct called capitalism, right? And it's interesting to me how often that's erased. It's just the global economy. It's just, there's a naturalisation of that particular political economic order, right? And so what I read is you with colleagues, and it's certainly a premise that I share, is bringing that back to the fore, that it's capitalism that's remaking the planet. And therefore, where I see an analogy with your thesis and some of the tradition of Marxist thought, which I think you'd recognise, is in that distinction between first and second nature. And Marx already by the 1860s or 70s saying most of the world has been transformed.
Exactly.
Right, into second nature. And I think he famously says, while you're here in Australia, it's the barrier reef. It's the last remaining area that hasn't been untouched. There's an analogue there, isn't there, for the planetary urbanisation thesis, which is picking up the Lefebvrean notion of sort of radical planetary scale urbanisation as a form of second nature, right? So everything's been, pretty well everything's been touched by that. Is that a fair cast to put on your narrative?
Absolutely, absolutely. A whole number of fundamental points there. So the first point that I would emphasize is this: I'm fundamentally committed to a critical approach to urban questions. And part of what I mean by that is an approach that is reflexive. Instead of simply presenting its categories as reflections of conditions on the ground that capture the full reality. In this tradition of theorizing, categories of thought are themselves part of the very social world that they're trying to grasp. So categories of thought are embedded within the very social relations that they're trying to understand. So part of what characterizes a critical approach, not just to urban theory, but to any kind of social theory, is reflexivity about exactly this embeddedness of the categories of thought in social relations. So in this sense, the concepts that we use to study urban questions are not neutral, photographic captures of reality. The concepts that we use to study urban questions are closely connected to power relations and also to strategies to shape and reshape the urban landscape. So the urban age concept, the notion of the 50% urban threshold that has become so popular these days, is not simply a scientific representation of population trends. It's closely connected to a whole range of emerging political strategies and planning strategies and design strategies which target cities, which target large population centers in particular ways for new forms of urban development. So in that context, precisely your emphasis on capitalism as a shaping force behind contemporary urbanization is certainly something that I would strongly agree with. I view contemporary patterns of urbanization as deeply and directly mediated through strategies of capital accumulation, strategies of profit making. Cities, but not only cities, the broader territories, indeed, within which cities are embedded, are being powerfully shaped through new strategies of capitalist industrialization and capital accumulation. And understanding that, or recognizing that, is essential to enabling us to decipher the particular patterns of urbanization that are emerging around the world, not only in the big cities of the world, but also, as we call it, within the broader operational landscapes of places that may not have large population centers or population densities, but which are functionally increasingly essential to supporting urban development elsewhere, whether in terms of agriculture or resource extraction or minerals extraction or any number of other functions, waste management, that support urban development within the big cities of the world.
And that the trajectory of thought that you described, and I think the premise, that critical premise on world urbanisation, links us to, doesn't it, that the way in which radical geographers, the late Neil Smith and others in recent decades, have extended the sort of Marxian understanding of the growth of the economy, the historical economy, through the concept of uneven development. And it really argues with those traditional machinic notions of the way cities grow, that they just, they sort of grow ever outwards, and it's a process of completion. So against that model, it tells us, it's uneven development in space, the spatial economy. It can have radical extensions. It can create redundancies and derelict landscapes. I'm not properly describing the thesis, but it commits us to that other thesis of uneven development, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, this is fundamental. So the concept of uneven development, and more specifically uneven spatial development, resonates very closely with the approach to urbanization that we have been developing. So in the standard or mainstream model of the history of capitalism, there are certain reified and relatively ahistorical spatial categories that are generalized across the entire history of capitalism. So above all, among others, the urban-rural division. So there's change within the urban side of that division in the sense that the number of people living within cities has expanded. And there's obviously change within the rural side of that division in the sense that so-called rural areas are depopulated and they're transformed in all kinds of important ways. But in most of the mainstream meta-narratives about the history of capitalist industrialization, that binarism, the urban-rural, is generalized across all of capitalist history. And a lot of what we are arguing is that that assumption is deeply misleading. The urban side of the equation, on the one hand, isn't very well captured through a single category. There are many urbanization processes that are producing many spatial patterns, many settlement patterns around the world. So in that sense, we need to pluralize our notion of urbanization instead of subsuming urbanization under a single morphology, the big city, the global city, the mega city region. We need to open up the question of different urbanization processes across time and space. And on the other side, just as importantly for us, and what's really prominently on display in the Operational Landscapes exhibition, the non-urban, the rural, that black box that supposedly is left behind through urbanization processes, we want to open that up. The rural is very important as a category of practice. It continues to be an important cultural category for thinking about certain conditions around the world. But as a category of critical social science, we think that increasingly it's quite limited. Many of the transformations that have been occurring in the so-called rural world during the last 2 centuries, for us, are directly connected to urbanization processes. So resource extraction, the industrialization of agriculture, the expansion of different kinds of logistics landscapes across so-called rural areas in order to transport raw materials and other commodities back to the big centers. For us, building on the work of Henri Lefebvre, those kinds of transformations represent the extension and thickening, albeit quite unevenly, of a worldwide urban fabric. So a big part of what we're trying to do in the Operational Landscapes exhibition is start to map that urban fabric, not just in large, relatively populated territories, but in some of the most remote places on the entire planet, some of the parts of the planet that have relatively low populations, but which are increasingly, we would argue, operationalized in order to serve urban development and city growth elsewhere. So the Arctic, the Amazon, the Gobi Desert Steppe, the Himalayas, Siberia, the Sahara, and the atmosphere itself, which is a slightly different conversation because of its non-territorial quality. But each of those regions, each of those zones or territories, in our argument, has increasingly been integrated within the fabric of world urbanization, above all during the last 2 or 3 decades. Quite a provocative claim to make in relation to a field of research that has tended to focus on large population centers as its main reference point.
Great. Now, I have to ask you this question. It's do with it what you will, but as someone who's had the privilege just being able to have a preview and see the exhibition and
Yes.
to almost feel it emotively, right? This thickening of the global capitalist spatial economy and of urbanisation, and the way in which, you know, through that exhibition you guys are able to radically reframe understandings of the Amazon, you know, not a wilderness, right? Something, the urban Amazon, right?
Exactly.
And so on and so forth. There's something monstrous about this as well. So I'm just reflecting off first emotion, seeing the exhibition. Those people, I imagine, who are committed to a wilderness preserving view of the world and protecting what we got left and live, they have that imaginary that that's still there and it's still possible, will be quite perturbed by this. Where do you think this, if you allow me, you don't have to use the term, but to use the term of monstrous urbanisation,
Yeah.
Where do you think it's going? Are we going to reset the whole possibility for species being here through global warming and default and dysfunction? Are we going to end up with a world without us?
Yeah, so this is a fundamental and very, very difficult question, and I don't know the answer to your question. I have a few thoughts. So one thought, and going back to the work of Neil Smith, which you alluded to earlier, very, very fundamental. One of the arguments that Neil Smith makes in his fundamental book, Uneven Development, is that actually the very idea of the wilderness or of nature as something that's radically outside of human impact emerges and gets generalized precisely at the moment when first nature is being ravaged through the process of capitalist development. So we start to hold on to and almost fetishize the idea of an untouched, pristine wilderness precisely when processes of industrialization are transforming the planet in unprecedented ways. So we have to, as it were, contextualize that feeling of monstrousness that you allude to in relation to the broader kind of historical forward motion of creative destruction processes under capitalism. Can we hold on to the notion of the pristine wilderness? Some scholars, such as William Cronin, would argue that that's actually a very dangerous notion, and that we're more effectively equipped to protect ecosystems if we recognize the ways in which all ecosystems on the planet are increasingly, fundamentally mediated through human action. And so for Cronin, and I'm very sympathetic to this idea, the starting point for reframing the question about a more viable human ecology, a more viable way of relating to the broader environments in the plural in which we live is precisely recognizing that we've already mediated pretty much all aspects of our relation to so-called nature. All of nature is already mediated through human action. So that reframes the question. It's not about protecting some pristine outside of human life. It's rather a question that's about our own form of social and spatial development. It's a question that we have to pose just as much about the big cities of the world as we do about zones like the Amazon or the Sahara or the Pacific Ocean that seem like they're relatively untouched by we humans, but which in fact, as we try to show in the exhibition, are fully being transformed by all kinds of different social, economic, environmental transformations associated not just with humans, but with capitalism.
Well, to bring it all home, at least to our home, and you're a very welcome visitor. Back to Australia, I invite your reflection on perhaps one way of looking at us, right? We've often or long conceived of ourselves as a nation of cities, or at least expert urban commentary has put that view. That is to say, for a very long time, in spite of all our sort of cultural stereotyping around us as a people of the bush and all that kind of thing, we've basically been one of the world's most highly urbanised nations, and a very preponderant urbanisation. A large proportion of the population lives in a very small number of major cities. Okay, so that view seems to play right into the critique that you're making of planetary urbanisation, of these sort of fixed containers of urban populations in contradistinction to the rural, urban, outback and all that. So I'd invite some comment on that. And the first thing I would want to draw to your attention, I'm sure it's in your mind, is the significance of the mining sector here in Australia, but also to the world, and you make a comment on that. So in some ways, it is so economically, but also politically and institutionally significant to our national life. It's headquartered, it does its business in our cities, our capital cities, so it's not like a backlot, a distant backlot. It's more of a present and powerful hinterland within the urban system here. Do you have some comment on that way of thinking about our cities?
Yeah, no, exactly. So this is fundamental. So the mainstream approach to representing urban life in Australia would generate a map in which basically you have the big population centers around the coastlines, and the rest of the country is basically empty, because the majority of Australia's population is obviously in the big cities. That's not up for debate. I think that's pretty much empirically established. So the question that our work would open up is, what does that mainstream mapping leave out? So The argument that we make is that actually we need, quite urgently, a much more extensive map of urbanization around the world, and certainly also in Australia, which would precisely include zones of agricultural production, zones of resource extraction, such as mining, which generate materials, food, fuel, minerals, and so forth, that support urban life elsewhere. In the case of Australia, the resource extraction and mining sectors generate materials that not only support the big cities and population centers of Australia, but which support urban development, large population centers around the world. So increasingly, the urban fabric of Australia, associated with resource extraction and so forth, it supports urban life on a world scale, not only within Australia. So these kinds of global hinterlands for us are really central to the worldwide fabric of urbanization, not only because of the land use transformations and environmental transformations that are associated, for example, with mining, but just as importantly, the very elaborate logistics infrastructures, ports, roads, canals, pipelines, and communications infrastructures that facilitate and coordinate extraction, circulation, and consumption of these commodities are absolutely essential dimensions of the urbanization process. So it generates essentially this way of thinking, a much more elaborate mapping of urbanization in Australia than the mainstream mapping, which just focuses on cities.
Thanks. Well, Neil Brenner, planetary urbanist. Thanks very much for the discussion, which I very much enjoyed, and best wishes for your stay with us here in the Melbourne School of Design this week.
Thank you so much, Brendan. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to dialogue with you and your colleagues.